I have had the possibility in mind for 1 full year now to make a video talking about how I first met and fell in love with my ex-wife. I had it in mind because I was speaking to my mother, somewhat acrimonious conversation, and I said to my mother, "You know, Gail, you never asked me this. Neither my mother nor my father, who's now deceased, neither of you ever asked me, neither of you showed any interest in how did I meet this woman, why did I fall in love with her?" And for me, that reflects a kind of strange pattern in my relationship with my parents, in that they just showed really no sincere interest in hearing my side of the story. Sort of in different fraught situations of conflict, whether that was a relatively trivial conflict between myself and my sister, or, a question like this, something that really matters, a complex, high-stakes series of negotiations surrounding my divorce. So this is probably going to be the first of a series of videos, probably spaced out over a couple of months, I don't know, where I look back on and reflect on my relationship with my ex-wife and our decision to get divorced and the situation I'm in now, legally, personally, and otherwise, which is a lot more interesting than anyone could reasonably imagine. Some of you guys have been long-term fans of my channel, saw my old videos that probably just took way too many hours to explain this stuff. I think all those videos were minimum 40 minutes long. And this video is relatively positive, relatively upbeat, and I think would be interesting to my own daughter in the near future. My daughter's now 5 years old, but when she's getting closer to 15 years old, I can definitely imagine her wanting to see a video like this. It's relatively positive, relatively upbeat, because it's basically about the positive qualities my ex-wife had, how we met and fell in love. We didn't get married by accident. And what can I tell you? There are things I really valued about her. So it's not just telling that story, but inevitably it's also telling you a bit about the kind of woman she was, her personal qualities or characteristics, or how she cultivated or developed them. I definitely think it would be meaningless to tell this story with a kind of blank placeholder where, the crucial character of my wife might be. So in terms of her character and her character formation, I really think the crucial thing to understand is how she emerged from and reacted against her father's personal philosophy or ideology. Now, this is true of many of us. I could describe my own character as something that emerged in contrast to things my parents believed in, things my parents taught me. Most obviously, communism. Up to a certain age, I'm listening and learning to what they say about politics. I'm listening and learning to what they say about economics and history. And then after a certain age, I'm becoming more and more skeptical. I'm doing my own reading. I'm challenging those ideas. And I'm discovering the extent to which things they've taught me are really wrong. So not everybody goes through this pattern. But, if you were raised Christian or Mormon or something and became an atheist, similar pattern, so on and so forth. Now, to my knowledge, I may be wrong, to my knowledge, my ex-wife's father has actually been diagnosed as having narcissistic personality disorder. And narcissistic personality disorder, one of the first things they tell you in textbooks and academic articles is to disregard the colloquial meaning of the word narcissism. Because they say, well, narcissistic personality disorder, it ended up with this peculiar name for different cultural and historical reasons. By the way, narcissism goes back to the myth of Narcissus and one particular poem, actually, in ancient Greek about Narcissus. So, it's ended up with this term appended to it, but it really has nothing to do with narcissism in the popular imagination, how we understand the meaning of that word. However, my ex-wife was raised being told again and again as a child that she was special, that society's rules did not apply to her. One of the things her father said again and again to her and her brother, often to both of them collectively, was, we're not like other people. We're not like normal people. That somehow the three of them were special and were superior to society's standards and normal rules. And this was in some ways part and parcel of her father's rejection of academia and higher education. And by the way, when I first met him and he first started to get to know me, he was one of the few people who saw it really positively, that I didn't have a PhD, that I'd gone out and become a scholar of Buddhism blazing my own trail, so to speak, doing my own research, that I'd done all this research and humanitarian work, making my own rules, and not being a part of the academic system. Because obviously some people, the first thing they say after they read my resume was, why aren't you in a PhD program? Good question. So anyway, there are some ways in which I relate positively myself to this guy's philosophy. And I can also see that, he came out of that kind of golden generation in computer programming, when you could have a great career in computer programming, even if you dropped out of high school, when formal credentials didn't matter that much in computer science, computer programming, especially in software. If you taught yourself how to do computer programming, you could have a career. To what extent that's still true today is debatable. It's not what we're talking about in this video. But you could see the way that sense of specialness and, anti-establishment independence fit very well with being a successful computer programmer in the era when the internet was first emerging, in the era when systems like Unix and Linux and those kinds of independent anti-establishment, vaguely anarchic projects were taking off. He was really part of that golden generation that's now come and gone. So he raised his kids with these expectations of themselves and this perception of society, and he imparted to them his cynicism about the prospect of getting things like a PhD. Of course, what's interesting about this is, when I met my ex-wife, when we met for the first time, she was precisely enrolled in a PhD, and it was specifically a PhD in anthropology. Before she entered into that PhD program, I think exactly what she was struggling with was the contrast between this sense of specialness, exceptionalism, and the mundane reality of being a waitress. I think already at that time, she was a jazz singer as a hobby. She had some other interests in the arts. But she did waitressing. She worked in a bookmark factory. She went through various long-term relationships with boyfriends who became ex-boyfriends. She had a very normal life in many ways. So this idea that she's not normal, that she's extraordinary, and that she didn't need higher education to distinguish herself and so on. Obviously, there was an incongruous contrast between the ideology of her childhood and what had to be, inevitably, the ideology of her adult years. And she had a series of conversations with someone at work. As I recall, this is when she was working as a waitress, and I forget if it was just one of her regular customers or a coworker. Well, there's a guy who had a series of conversations with her, and he said to her one day, based on her interests and her character, based on having getting to know her a little bit, he said, well, look, I know you're interested in going back to university and getting a PhD in something. Anthropology. Anthropology would really suit you. And she looked into it a little bit, I assume with a few Google searches, what have you, and that was the path she decided to take. Now, we live in a very peculiar world this way. The decisions of just a few people created that opportunity for her. And I later met some of the professors who made those decisions. And, in case you think there's any higher power or grand scheme or divine plan or what have you, no. It's really random. It's really arbitrary. It's not that it's random. It's that it's arbitrary. It comes down to a face-to-face meeting with one professor on one day, and whether or not he's in a good mood, and whether or not you tell him what he wants to hear about your research interests and so on and so forth. It's a little bit scary just how arbitrary that can be. And she was ultimately given the extraordinary opportunity to get a PhD at Cambridge University. Now, when I met her, she was already at the stage of being totally disillusioned with that PhD, having lost all faith in the institution, all sense of direction and motivation in terms of the content of the research she was doing, and she had more or less made up her mind to drop out of the PhD or to delay it for many years. And again, this probably partly reflected, her own upbringing, that she was armed with cynicism going into this. But I think that really is a mass phenomenon, definitely in British academia, that people make serious sacrifices and devote themselves to higher learning. And then when they arrive in the institution, it is simply not what they were expecting. It falls short of their hopes. And that may be that they're disappointed in the content of what they're learning. It may be that they're disappointed with the particular people who are their professors in positions of authority, and there's no negotiating with the authority figures in these cases. Either you have to conform or you have to get out. That's definitely how it is in elite British academia for British education, whether or not it's a little bit different where you are. If you're watching this in Greece or Samoa or Southeast Asia, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Cambridge and Oxford, and they're in some ways a particularly extreme form of Western English language academia that does indeed rely on a lot of flattery and bootlicking and what have you. It's an ultra-conformist atmosphere at the same time that it ostensibly praises and valorizes kind of Socratic values of free discourse and questioning. My ex-wife and I both received an email that was about one sentence long. And it was an email from a gray-haired white man living in Kunming, China. He did have a PhD. He had a PhD from Hong Kong University. And he had inherited enough money to survive, at least in China, indefinitely. He did not live in wealth at all. He had a small apartment in Kunming. And I'll always remember his apartment. In a parallel life, this could have been me. He had almost no furniture in the whole apartment. So it was an apartment large enough to raise a family in China. And several of the rooms of the apartment, he had no bookshelves. He just had books lined up along the wall, the edges of the walls, all the way around the apartment. So he could walk through the apartment and find the book he needed for his research. So he was an eccentric intellectual doing his own research and working on some combination of books. He was also, to some extent, a true-believing communist or Marxist, which made him a bit of a natural enemy of mine. This guy had met us both, and he sent a one-line email to both of us and said, hey, you two should get to know each other. You two should meet up sometime. And later on, we actually met him face-to-face, and we thanked him. We sent him an email, because later on, when it was clear we were going to get married and so on, we said, well, it's all thanks to you, that we met up and started talking. So that was the start of an email correspondence with her at a time when my life was going through dramatic changes. And I think what's really worth emphasizing is that in the months that followed immediately, I became the motivation and direction for her research, for her putting her effort back into that PhD seriously. And I mean, obviously, if she were telling her side of the story, she might remember that differently. But most people have known, not just my girlfriends, like not just intimate friendships and lovers. It's not as if they've grown up around a whole lot of examples of what it means to be an intellectual. And the examples you have in front of you might be really peculiar people on television. It might be Kanye West. Seriously. What does it mean to be an intellectual? There are probably a few figures you've seen interviewed on the news. For me, playwrights and artists. Pablo Picasso. It's a horrible example. What does it mean to be an intellectual? If you think it's living like Pablo Picasso, it's a terrible example. So in meeting me, I became an example and a symbol of a lot of things that she had been looking for in her own life and she was hoping to find in that PhD program she didn't find. I also became the answer to a lot of questions that she had about communism, sure, because she was doing research on communist China, but also about Buddhism, about a lot of meaningful questions that were going on in her mind and that she wasn't getting answers to within the hothouse of Western academia. So from the first time we met, there was a lot to talk about. It was a romantic and dramatic meeting. She actually ended up taking an even longer bus journey than I did. I think I took the bus from Bangkok, Thailand, all the way to Vientiane, Laos, and then from Laos all the way up to China, up to Yunnan, China. We met in the small town of Jinghong. And her trip, even though it was all within China, she took a trip from the extremely remote mountainous area of Nujiang to Kunming, and then took a bus from Kunming down to Jinghong. And why did we both make this extraordinary sacrifice of time. And in those days, riding long distance buses in China and South Asia was not comfortable. It was really harrowing to go this enormous distance. She thought, in terms of the schedule of her PhD, that she only had a brief window of time when it would be possible for her to meet me face to face. And then she'd have to fly back to England and fly back again a significant time later. So we thought we had only a brief window of opportunity. We ended up having a couple of months together. So, we met, we fell in love, we had tremendous physical chemistry. I'm sorry, but to be blunt, I think this is part of the story that has to be included. I was the best sex she'd ever had in her life by far. It really changed the way she thought about herself, not just as an intellectual, but also, in terms of her sexuality and her, relations with men. It gave her a new perspective on all that stuff. And, from the very first week we spent together, there were a lot of red flags about what was wrong with her and how this relationship would inevitably end. There were a lot of red flags in her behavior. There were things she said and did that were frankly crazy. And they didn't just go on for 5 minutes or 15 minutes. In many cases, they went on for hours and hours. And why did I overlook those red flags? Someone from the outside might say, well, Eisel, you thought this woman was kind of good on paper. That's an old-fashioned idiom. She's in a PhD program. She has a respectable education. Therefore, she can't be crazy or she can't be dishonest, which is one of the real problems here. Or she can't be a malignant narcissist or these other issues that were to come up in the course of the relationship and the divorce. You must have just been kind of seduced by the idea that this woman was exactly what you were not. This woman was formally enrolled in a PhD and getting the credentials that you yourself lack, and that still now in 2018 I lack. That she was she was a formal intellectual and scholar, whereas I was an informal, autodidact, self-defined, self-made scholar. That was not what it was at all. There were really serious red flags from the first week we spent together. But I chose to overlook those red flags because I could recognize that from the first day we spent together, this woman was falling in love with me. I can't even say she completely fallen in love with me. That she was in a situation where she was in a state of extreme emotional distress or whatever, the pressure she felt under. I could see that, for example, the first time we talked about Buddhism, she was trying so hard to say what she thought I wanted to hear about Buddhism. And, again, this is something that's happened repeatedly in my life. There's a moment, I'm certain she remembers it also, where we were both sitting on the couch. We'd been together for a few days, but it was still the first week of the relationship. And she said to me, when she was really being sincere, looking into my eyes, she said to me, I feel like we should just kind of get rid of we should get rid of the pretense of having a period of dating or something. I want to marry you. I think you and me should get married. And I laughed in a kind of cool and detached way. And I said, there are some questions that I think you should leave until the second week of the relationship. That was our first week together, and she was completely head over heels in love with me. And you can tell even from that anecdote, it's not that there was a big gap in age between us. We have 3 years difference in age. It wasn't there was a big gap in experience between us. If anything, I think she was more experienced in love and relationships than I was. But I was more detached and clear thinking about the relationship. And she was, completely, utterly in love with me. So the positive side of how I met and fell in love with my ex-wife is precisely that from the first day, from the first week, there was the potential there for a partnership to get so much done in terms of research, education, learning, having a life where each part of the relationship, each partner is stimulating the other to accomplish more, to get more done in their lives. The level of debate and mutual scrutiny we could have where I could read her work and criticize it and tell her productively how to improve it, and vice versa. The potential for us to be, in that sense, a power couple, obviously not in terms of making money. I think both of us really felt it. And each of us provided for the other what we had been looking for in our friends and colleagues for years, but that our friends and colleagues in reality had utterly failed to provide us with. So with the significant caveat that from the very first week, there were red flags. There were really serious red flags that I was putting my trust in someone who was not trustworthy, someone I could never trust and should never trust, and that I chose to overlook those red flags. With that footnote having been stated, the relationship started off on this incredibly positive and optimistic note. And with all of the bad and terrible things you're going to learn in the other videos in this series, I can say that for both of us, it was a tremendously intellectually stimulating and productive period of our lives. A lot of misery, a lot of heartbreak, a lot of other negative things to say. But for me, I made the transition from being a scholar of Buddhism to, switched from learning Laotian to learning Chinese to learning Cambodian to learning Cree, learning Ojibwe, First Nations University, and all these other transitions, all these other dramatic reversals of fortune for me. I wrote and presented the lectures that I did at Cambridge and Oxford and England. I did all this original research. It was also a period of time for me bringing together and writing and publishing the research I'd done in the years leading up to it. It was and for her, it was the period of time when she brought together and wrote up the research that was in her PhD thesis. That, in brief, is the story of how I and my ex-wife met and fell in love.